Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Today is, what is it, Tuesday? Tuesday, November 21st, 2017, starting at 3:49 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, and this is the 134th episode of the show. Joining me today are Austin Coppock and Kelly Surtees, and we're going to be talking about the astrological forecast for December of 2017. For more information about how to support the podcast or to subscribe to the podcast and support the production of future episodes by becoming a patron, please visit theastrologypodcast.com/subscribe. All right. Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I can't believe we're already doing another forecast episode. It seems like the last few weeks flew by.
Totally. Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Nice to be back.
Yeah, this is always my favorite time of the month. So, in this episode, we're going to first do some news and announcements briefly. Then we're going to talk about a couple of general topics. One of them is mundane astrology and the other is horary astrology. And then later in the episode, we're going to jump into the astrological forecast for December. And also I'm going to mention one auspicious electional chart for December that Lisa Scheim picked out for us this month. So if you want to jump ahead to the forecast and you're listening to this now, then just look at the description on the podcast website, and there'll be a timestamp for jumping forth to those different parts of the discussion. So let's start with some news and announcements. So first things first, I do have a plug for Moses Sirigar, who was featured on episode 123. He's actually teaching a class in 2017 on locational astrology and Vedic astrology for Western astrologers. So for more information about that, visit astrologyforthesoul.com. Kelly, what do you have coming up this month?
So in December, I'll be focusing on client consults. So I tend to do a lot of year ahead one-on-one sessions in December and in January. And I realize I do have one final webinar for the year, which I'll be part of a panel discussion through Astrology University on December 18th, December 17th, December 17th, 18th, depending on where you are in the world. It'll be 5 a.m. for me in Sydney, Australia on the 18th. So that'll be a fun discussion. I shall be honouring Saturn's dedication to getting up early. So yeah, that's exciting. It for me. Yeah.
Okay. And your website's kellysastrology.com?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. And Austin, what do you got coming up next month?
A whole lot of writing. As you know, I do a column every decan. And I also do a paragraph on the configuration of every single day. But when, special things happen, I have to address them. And so Saturn's moving into Capricorn. That needs a lengthy treatment. And we're about to begin a new calendar year, which also needs a lengthy treatment. So I will be, I'll be spending a lot of time in writing prison. And like yourself, I fund some of my labors with Patreon. And although the daily delineations come out for free in the morning every day, anyone who is a supporter of my Patreon gets all 30 to 31 days of the next month as a PDF on the first of the month. And there are other benefits as well. But
nice. Awesome. All right. And your website is austincoppock.com, right?
Yep.
All right, brilliant. And as for myself, I am working on podcasting primarily and going to be doing a webinar coming up for students in my Hellenistic course where we're going to be reading through the text of Vedius Valens and talking about his treatment of annual perfections. So we've been doing a lot of those live read-throughs of different ancient authors recently, and it's been a lot of fun talking about the text, looking at their example charts, and applying some of the techniques in practice. And I did the Saturn and Sagittarius Saturn returns retrospective earlier this month, and we actually covered 13 charts with Lisa and Patrick. But I had so many Saturn return stories, a lot of listeners actually submitted them that I wasn't able to include them all in that discussion. And then additionally, what I ended up doing with that episode, I went back and forth between sort of retelling those stories so we could get a bunch in and I could do sort of short bullet point versions versus doing actual interviews with people. And we ended up doing the first one where I just retold the stories. But in the end, I felt like I was missing a lot of the nuances and the details surrounding some of those stories, which are very vivid, like in a consulting or a client setting when you're talking to somebody about their chart. and they're telling you about their Saturn return, like the nuances and the details and the emotion behind it, that carries a lot of weight that you miss when you're just another person retelling someone else's story. So I'm thinking about doing like a longer workshop or a class or a webinar or something where I do some interviews with some of those people who submitted Saturn return stories in order to be able to capture the essence of some of those stories a little bit better than we did in that episode. So if I end up doing that, I should have more information about it pretty soon here. All right. I think that's it. And speaking of that, I mean, now that we're ending Saturn return, Saturn in Sagittarius, did you guys see some pretty good Saturn return stories in retrospect? Or do you feel like you did?
Yeah, I think it's been sort of constant for years now. So I don't necessarily have one that jumps to mind. But
yeah,
it's just been an ongoing
you've had
thing.
people in your life who had that placement so that you got to see some like up close and personal.
Yeah. I mean, we know several of the same people with Saturn and Sagittarius. Watson being one of them. Watson
was our first case study.
Shared his tale of adulthood and woe.
Right. Yeah, and I felt I meant to go back on that because we ended up focusing a little bit too much on some of the hardships that he went through. But in retrospect and talking about it, he actually, some positive and some constructive things came out of that as well. So it wasn't all depressing.
Right. Like living beings.
Yeah. I mean, he has children. And while that was like a large part of the difficulties, there was also some very positive things, obviously, that came out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Kelly? Any notable Saturn return stories that you've seen over the past couple of years?
Look, I'm sure, like Austin, I'm sure there have been none that come to mind immediately. The transit that I've seen clients struggle the most with Saturn in Sag has been when that's corresponded with the second house transit for them. So the idea of maybe Saturn being in the sign of Jupiter, so natally it's an area of life that is normally a little bit more abundant or flowing, or they've got a bit of luck, and people really noticing when Saturn was in Sag and the second house, the contraction or the limitation or the tightening of the belt around money and cash flow. So that's the thing that pops to mind immediately.
Sure, definitely. And I've been surprised since the Saturn and Sag episode, as Saturn's like getting closer to and gaining speed to move into Capricorn, how I'm already seeing some of those people, the Saturn returns of people that have Saturn in early Capricorn are already getting queued up, right away. And you can see how that's about to start very, very soon. So like one of the ones I was watching in the news was like Kevin Spacey has Saturn in the first few degrees of Capricorn. And when that story about him first broke, I was like, oh, that's weird. Because at first it was just one sort of isolated thing and it wasn't clear what was happening with that. And I saw that he was about to start his second Saturn return. And I'm like, well, that almost implies this is going to be more significant for him than it seems. And then over the course of the next week, just like his career imploded. And this is all happening, right before he starts his second Saturn return with it in early Capricorn. So there's some interesting stories queuing up like that already.
One thing that's interesting about that is that because Sagittarius and Capricorn flank the solstice, the points in late Sagittarius and early Capricorn are in an anticial relationship to each other. So you would get an anticial conjunction between Saturn at 25 Sagittarius and another planet that's at 5 Capricorn. So that's something I think that may be it's one of the factors that may be leading to not premature, but I don't know. Yeah, things happening a little earlier of a Saturn return nature for those people who have an early Capricorn.
Yeah, definitely. And somebody was asking me about this also, because it also has to do with just the difference between and the challenge sometimes of integrating sign-based versus degree-based aspects. And in that episode, I was really trying to emphasize that the sign-based portion, because people aren't usually used to thinking about the Saturn return in terms of it returning to your natal sign and it being in effect for the entirety of that period that it's going back through the natal sign that you had Saturn in. But then it's also true that the degree-based aspects with orbs are relevant. And if a person has Saturn at the very beginning of a sign or Saturn at the very end of the sign, you're still going to see crossover while transiting Saturn is with an orb of making a degree-based aspect to that natal position. So that's relevant as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've used a whole sign parameter for Saturn since probably my Saturn return back 2007, 2008. And
Yeah.
I have Saturn at 10 degrees of Virgo. And I remember hoping that the sign-based thing was wrong because it's like, all right, Saturn's at like 25 Virgo right now. This shouldn't feel like this. No, it still feels like it.
It's
And
Yeah.
still
I
going.
and I remember Saturn. So Saturn ingressed into Libra. I believe it was a fall, and
Yeah.
then I was like, oh my god! And I just felt the weight lift. I was like,
Yeah.
there's Saturn still Saturning, but it's not in my face. And then it moved back into Virgo, and I was like,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I'm so done with my Saturn return. That was like 2 years ago. No, not at all. Neither event-wise nor on an affect level. Even that like last dip back into just a couple degrees of Virgo, even though it was 17 degrees away from my natal Saturn. The experience and the events were very Saturn returny. So as much as I wanted it to be wrong, the sign-based general parameter for the Saturn return was unfortunately accurate for me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's so crucial just because, that's taking something that's more from ancient astrology and integrating it into modern astrology, just the concept, something as simple as sign-based aspects, but then it can really change how you approach the interpretation of simple modern concepts like the Saturn return.
Yeah, I've been getting more and more into whole sign aspects in general for a variety of reasons. But the implication is that the signs really matter, that they're real territories, and that they're separate in a meaningful way. They're not just sort of the transitions between them aren't vague.
Right.
So,
No.
which is, it's if we're, and there's probably no piece of astrology that is as widely known and as widely used as the signs, right? And so, it makes sense that there would be some, how should you say, that those bones would be firm, right? Because why would we keep referring back to that interpretive structure if it wasn't, why would it have endured for thousands of years if it wasn't rather sturdy?
And that sounds like a pretty Saturn in Capricorn kind of statement. The bones, the structure, the sturdiness of that foundation.
The boundaries are real.
Yes. Totally. On that point, I haven't noticed yet necessarily Saturn return for Saturn in Cap clients, but in the last few weeks, I have had a run on clients with Mars in the first 2 or 3 degrees of Cancer. So the idea of as soon as Saturn goes in, they're going to start flipping or getting the opposition transit. So that, I think, it doesn't have to just be the Saturn returns. If you've got a planet in those first, well, I think Saturn in Cap's going to cover the first 8 degrees of Capricorn in 2018. So if you do have an early planet, not only will it be in play by sign, but it's going to be maximum strength at that degree placement very, very soon.
Right. And didn't it got pretty late before it stationed retrograde earlier this year, didn't it? Was it like 26 or 28 Sagittarius?
27 maybe?
Okay.
I shall check.
Yeah, because
that was
that's
in
hugely
March.
relevant as well, because that's already kicking off some transits even as far back then in terms of the degree-based aspects, especially for those people that have placements in very early, Capricorn or whatever other cardinal signs.
Absolutely. And particularly the Sag Capricorn link that Austin was talking about, Saturn did retrograde at 27 Sag in early April. So the Antisha connection was there for planets at 3 or 4 degrees of Capricorn way back in early 2017.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. All right, cool. So that was one discussion topic. The other discussion topic I had for our little pre-forecast segment that we always do is I got into kind of like a debate with somebody recently on Facebook where they were questioning the legitimacy of looking at like mundane world transits and then applying them to essentially like current events in the news, and saying that that's overly, that you're taking something that's very general and you're applying it in an overly specific way to just like something that's going on in a certain country or with a certain group of people or in a certain part of the world. And that's like an overly narrow and not justified application of astrology, especially if you're not showing how it's linked back to like a natal chart or, an inception chart or a country chart or something like that in order to demonstrate how it's actually relevant to or linked to that specific group or country or what have you. And the debate didn't really actually end up going anywhere that useful or productive, but it did raise some interesting sort of ideas for me, or some interesting issues, because that was actually something I struggled with and also had a similar perspective on, where I always thought it was a little bit weird or a little bit generic when sometimes astrologers would talk about mundane transits and try to personalize them without linking them back to a person's natal chart, because I sort of started astrology with Astrodienst already being around and their personal daily transit thing being very much linked into your natal chart. So anytime that you're looking at transits, it's always with respect to your own natal chart. So it's very personalized. But over the course of the past 2 years, I think it's been 2 years, or maybe it's been 3 years now since we've been doing these forecast episodes, I've really developed a much greater appreciation for the way in which you can look at what's going on in the sky right now and link that to current events and have that be personally or very relevant and very valid. And I think part of the reason is just that it often is hooking into the charts. There's often many charts that are operating. There's thousands or millions of charts that are operating at all times underlying events. And you don't always have access to those because you don't always have birth times for them, or you aren't always aware of them, but they are getting linked into those mundane transits in a very specific way. And that was part of my justification for why what we do sometimes with these forecast episodes is valid from a conceptual standpoint. I know both of you have written columns like that for a long time, but did you ever struggle with that issue, or did you ever have a point of transitioning from personal transits and astrology that's directly connected to individual charts to doing it and talking about it in a more general sense?
Well, I'll go first. I would say that that's something that I've thought about every time I've written a column for the last 12 years, because the question is I don't have the chart of the person I'm writing to, right? I don't know. And so what can I say versus what is, because you want to give as much generally valid information as you can, but you certainly don't want to overstate your case, right? Because I would delineate, let's say, Mars's ingress to Scorpio generally in a different way than I would delineate that for someone who had the moon at 2 Scorpio. Right.
Yeah.
And who is in a moon ruled perfection. Right. The transits are a vital piece of the prognostic engine, and you can delineate what the impact of that piece is. But of course, if you want to get more specific, you need more layers, and that's true in every branch of astrology. Another thing that I will say is that there's a difference between transits as triggers for big changes or installments in big stories that are already underway for a person or a culture, versus the planet just being there and offering its potential if you want. It's easier to have a good time when Venus is in a place of great dignity and not afflicted by the malefics. And if you reach out to Venus, it is easier to, get handed a basket of fruit when Venus is in Libra than when Venus is in, say, Virgo. And that is one of the principles that traditional planetary magic operates under. Is that you can pick the ripe fruits of the heavens. I believe that was a metaphor Al Cummins had that I really liked. You can reach out and grab the fruit off the tree. You don't necessarily have to sit there until it falls on your head, right? Whereas, like a more predictive transit is waiting, is figuring out when the apple will fall on someone's head. But, you can reach up and grab some fruit, and the transiting conditions of the planets give you an idea of what's available and what will be easier or harder to access. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I could see somebody making a counterpoint then in those instances, like with traditional electional magic, you're supposed to, if you really want to make, let's say, a talisman or something, you're supposed to lock it into like a specific time. Like, let's say, when Venus is rising in Libra, and that becomes the way that you specifically unlock the power of that general transit at that time. So it's like, what is the difference then between?
Well, that's one piece of traditional astrological magic. The extremely specific elections for a talisman cast in stone and metal is one thing, and that is the most exacting, I would say, or technically exacting form of planetary magic, because you're taking, lack of a better term, the energy or spirit of that moment and giving it a durable metal and stone body to endure for as long as possible. There are a variety of other operations, such as planetary petitions, who don't have the same level of rigor required in order for them to be effective. The super exact electional talismanic stuff is real and important, but that defines one edge. That edge being the most exacting. There are a variety of other methods which are less exacting, where you don't have to have the perfect chart.
Sure. Just the general point is that the general, state of the cosmos at that time, and the fact that, let's say, Venus is transiting through Libra itself, is going to imprint it with some of the quality of that transit.
Yeah, that's literally there. It's part of this time, it's part of what's happening. And, obviously you'd probably want to reach out for that when it's on an angle, or when it's the day and hour of Venus, or when the moon's conjunct it, or, whatever other secondary, tertiary, quaternary figure or techniques you want to use to further focus on that, where it's easier to get to that, or it's easier for it to get to you. But that's sort of a thing. Like, the planets' current positions and configuration with each other is what's on offer. And just because you don't have a life-changing event doesn't mean that the planet's current condition and position isn't impacting or texturing your experience to some degree.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you think, Kelly?
I tend to think of it as like describing the astrological weather, which is maybe a metaphor that's been done to death, but it seems to be relevant in this situation, that the cycles that we look at, say month ahead or year ahead, we're describing the nature of time or the quality of experience that looks, that is available based on the symbolism. And, just like a weather report, we live in a very cold part of Canada. So in the middle of winter, there can be a horrible ice situation going outside, which doesn't affect me because I don't work outside the house. So that's the weather, but it doesn't affect me personally. But it would affect my husband because he's part of a larger organization where transport's a big thing. And so I think I didn't struggle with this because I sort of understood from the get-go that there are some limitations. When you're talking about the astrological cycles of a month or a year ahead, that is by nature going to be more general and less specific than if you talk specifically with an individual about their chart and what's being activated in terms of whatever cycles or timing techniques you want to use. So to my mind, I'm sort of like, that's the nature of the beast, and it has value in that, as Austin's saying, we're describing what's available, what we can reach for. And, so if Venus is in Virgo, this may not be the best time to throw a party where it's all about eating sweets and cakes, but Venus in Virgo could be a great time to throw a party where you're going to eat raw veg or green juice or something. So it's just sort of understanding the vibe that's out there. And then to the extent that you're interested in connecting with that, going for it. But of course, when you work with your own chart and the way things are triggering you and your sensitive points, that's going to be much more specific, maybe more accurate, more dramatic, or more significant.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, the thing that's really important that I've noticed as we've been doing this more and more on the podcast over the past few years, just by paying closer attention, is that you really do see the symbolism, especially of certain outer planet transits, come up when those planets start moving through different signs. I mean, and in that sense, looking at events in the news or looking at world events does become hugely relevant because you can see that symbolism playing out. I mean, we've all seen the way that like Saturn and Sagittarius has played out with many of those themes, some of which we stated in that Saturn and Sagittarius episode as sort of like expected or probable manifestations. But then, I keep remarking over the past few months just how literal some of that has been over the course of the past few years in terms of capturing some of that symbolism. But even before that, like Saturn in going through Scorpio, and that transit started out with like the head of the NSA or the CIA at the time, Petraeus, was like caught having an affair, and the FBI investigated, and then all these stories started coming out about privacy and online communications and stuff. And it turned out that was just a preview for a bunch of discussions that would happen over the next few years, because then 6 months later, 6 months into Saturn in Scorpio or so, the Edward Snowden thing happened, and suddenly there's these disclosures about the NSA like spying on worldwide traffic, and all the subsequent discussions about like secrecy and privacy and other things that came along with that over the course of the next year or two. So some of these things are tied into specific events, but sometimes it's like a series of ongoing events that are interconnected, that are all connected to a similar theme or sort of echoing a similar theme. And you can see that in world events.
Yeah, absolutely.
Totally. Sure.
I guess, one of the things is it might be hard to see that if you're just coming into the field, or if you hadn't. One of the discussions I had on the last episode with Adam Ellenboss was the difference between sort of like book knowledge of astrology, like when you get into astrology and you've been doing it for a little while, and you can like interpret like what a Saturn return or something means theoretically, and you've read other case studies and things like that, versus the sort of wisdom that is accumulated from experience of either going through the transit yourself and coming out the other end of it and developing some deep personal understanding of it, or observing it happening like contemporaneously through events or people that and this sort of immediate gut level experience that you get from seeing it, play out in somebody's life over the course of a few years or what have you, that there's something very different about those two types of knowledge.
Totally. It's funny you bring this up. I was just talking with my students last night in our last online chart interpretation class around your book learning, the ability to regurgitate a theory that you read in a textbook or a series of keywords or concepts. That takes you so far in your astrology, but it will not take you all the way. The way that you really deepen and integrate your understanding of astrology is through the doing. So the idea of talking with people about their charts, whether you do it in a professional paid capacity, whether you're like the go-to for your social network or your family, but you do learn things about the way the cycles operate, both personally and collectively, only through that experience and that observation. So I completely agree with you, Chris. That's a point that I'm really passionate about, that if you want to get better as an astrologer, you need to start using the astrology in some way. Whether you're consulting with people, whether you're blogging about it, you need to create some kind of feedback loop where you're getting other people's stories and experiences, as well as paying deep attention to your own when you go through those cycles.
Right. And that's so tough because it doesn't seem evident that it should be that way, I think, necessarily, because you think you should be able to just study past experiences or read books or study other case studies. But then there really is something unique when you're seeing clients and talking to them about their charts where, and this is some weird, it's like a weird thing that is most practicing and older astrologers know, but that you assume, most newer astrologers don't realize is the case, that every consulting astrologer continuously learns something new from every client they see or every chart they see. And that's true, both of, people that have been in the field for 10 or 15 years, like the three of us have, or 20 years or whatever, but also even for, much older astrologers like Stephen Forrest or Robert Hand or Demetra George. It's like every chart presents a unique case and a unique constellation of placements, and therefore sometimes a unique manifestation of placements that you've seen in other instances.
Yeah. The nuances are phenomenal. So your book learning gets you into the topic. You can scratch the surface, and your client will share a vignette or a story or make one comment, and you will just get this whole other level of understanding about how that configuration can come together that you could never have read in a book anywhere, because it's too specific to the uniqueness of that chart because the nature of our book learning, it's a little bit more like this planet in this sign or in this house, and you can't cover every configuration, I guess.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it still fits the overall like archetypal, let's say, general feeling of the placement. It's just that the specific manifestation itself is often so highly specific that it's not something that you would usually like look up in a book and it'll describe that exact scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you
and that's kind of the magic of astrology. But yeah, what do you think, Austin?
When did you make the transition, or did you make a hard transition from, doing astrology privately to seeing clients, or was it a gradual transition?
It was gradual. I would say the only hard punctuation mark was when I decided to do astrology full time and swore not to get a normal job. But I've been doing charts for years for people for years at that point. I think I started in college. I think I charged like $8 or $10. No, I charged 1 order of General Tso's chicken for a reading. That was my price when I was.
That's
23.
a good deal.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I was a little bit more hit and miss back then.
Yeah.
I think it was probably a fair deal. It's like when you go to the what is it? It's like the you can there's like I want to say hair college. That's not the right term, but the people who are like training to be estheticians and beauticians, you can get like you can pay half as much and let a trainee work on you.
Yeah.
So. But,
same with like naturopaths, massage therapists, all the natural therapies. Yeah. When they're doing their apprenticeship, their last year, you can pay half price, and you're just understanding they don't have the experience, but
they're like, listen, I'm learning, and you're like, all right, well, and that's an important thing to say. That's actually something I was just talking about with some of my students. I was like, you need to, in order to get to a level where you're comfortable and professionally competent, you're gonna have to read a lot of charts and talk to a lot of people, and so it's entirely reasonable to not want to accidentally say a bunch of dumb or wrong or hurtful stuff, and to therefore avoid saying things when you're not sure of your competence. Right. But there are a lot of circumstances where you're like, listen, I'm learning, this might be useful, I might just be stupid, but I need to practice. Is that something you're interested in? Do you understand the parameters, right? And that there is that sort of apprentice journeyman sort of framework that's I think very necessary to get from apprentice to master. And I mean master in the old guild structure sense of somebody who's competent at a craft and can teach it, not somebody who is the world's best. I did want to say one thing about the associating events with planetary positions. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I think that this is it's just a piece of watching astrology happen. It's a piece of astrology. That doesn't mean that it can't be done poorly. And I think some of the people that I've seen complaining about that particular method are probably referencing some astrologers or students of astrology who are not very rigorous and who are just sort of throwing everything into the same basket. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and that is a legitimate objection, that sometimes astrologers can be too quick to ascribe whatever thing just happened to whatever transit's happening in the sky, or sometimes not good astrology that's not very discerning can sometimes have a tendency to do that. And so this discussion that happened was originally about Jupiter and Scorpio, and a lot of people were associating a lot of the, I don't even know, it's become such a big thing. I don't know what to refer to it as. It was like, but it started with the Harvey Weinstein thing, where when Saturn was still in Libra, and already very early people were saying, well, this must be what Jupiter and Scorpio is going to be about. And at that point, even I was a little like, people might be jumping a little bit too quick, because Jupiter's still in Libra. We don't really know. This is one guy, and we don't really know where this is going to go. But then over the course of the next few weeks, it really did blow up into this huge thing that's covering a lot of different, it's not just Hollywood, but also there's, reporters, there's, people in the media, there's musicians, there's a lot of different people now, and a lot of different things surrounding this that are happening. It's become a much bigger event that clearly is associated, at least in part, with that transit of Jupiter through Scorpio. But sometimes it's true that there can be a tendency for astrologers sometimes to misassign meanings or to overassign it. Like, sometimes Mercury retrograde can be one of those things where, sometimes Mercury retrograde and stuff goes amiss or things go wrong. Other times, maybe some astrologers do have a tendency to overdo it occasionally.
Yeah, well, one of the points that that I saw raised, and I didn't follow this terribly carefully, but somebody was like, well, if it's Jupiter's in Scorpio for the entire world, why is this all just centered in the United States, right? And that of course begs, because the thing is, sometimes you can say general things like we did for Saturn and Sag, like the boundary between the native and the foreigner, right? Like the familiar and the alien, and that particular wall or boundary or bridge being highlighted and troubled during Saturn's time in Sagittarius. That was true all over the world, right? Or on every continent where we could perceive patterns, we could see that pattern, right? Whereas with Jupiter in Scorpio, if we're talking about, how should we say, the blessing of revelation or speaking up, so far that pattern has been located primarily, I don't want to say exclusively because I haven't been paying enough attention to international news, but primarily in the United States. So then we might say, oh, well, what's going on in the US chart? Oh, wow, Scorpio is the 12th whole sign house with the Sag rising. That makes even more sense. And we just had this eclipse. And the eclipse seemed to be tightly tied into at least some of the charts of the people who are getting who are falling from grace, right? As Patrick Watson pointed out, Louis C.K.'s Venus is in a position where the eclipse over the summer was right on top of it. And so, we can go through there, but it doesn't mean that, you can say here's a Jupiter and Scorpio pattern, but in order to point to the country or the people that it is going to impact most deeply, you do definitely need to, bring up other charts. So I don't know. It all ties together. I don't feel like there's a real, this is invalid or that's invalid. We just do it well and know the limitation and strength of every particular gear. We're only able to use a certain set of gears without having charts to interlock them with.
Right. Well, and the other thing is that sometimes there's a weird middle ground or transition point when something is initially just something that's happening in a single person's life versus when it expands to a group of people versus when it becomes a worldwide phenomenon. And sometimes, very early on in the transit, you don't realize that this is going to become a much bigger phenomenon than it ends up eventually becoming. So like the Arab Spring, for example, started out where it's often traced back to like a single guy setting himself on fire in protest. And then this sparked a sort of series of other protests that then engulfed the area and then eventually had a sort of worldwide effect. Or when I remember back when Saturn went into Sagittarius initially, because it dipped into Sag, then it went back into Scorpio, and then it moved back into Sag. And I remember, around that time, that was when a lot of the immigration started happening from Syria, which had been sort of like become this war-torn area over the course of a few years up to that point. And then the sort of immigration to Europe started happening as a trickle, and then it became a huge thing over the course of that summer. And then that had sort of ripple effects over the course of the next couple of years in different areas of the world based on that in different positive and negative ways. So sometimes, one of the things I learned from that is just that sometimes when you have a new ingress that takes place, if you start seeing events early on in that seem to symbolically match what that transit is supposed to be about theoretically or abstractly or conceptually, sometimes those can become much bigger, or you can anticipate those becoming much bigger and having a larger ripple than they might otherwise if it's just after an ingress has taken place. Because when the ingress takes place, like the events surrounding what the next however long that transit is going to be about start being put in place right at the start of it oftentimes. So this Jupiter and Scorpio thing might be similar because we're only like a month or so into it at this point, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger rather than something that's, dying down or something like that. All right.
Totally.
So the only other thing I meant to mention with the mundane thing is as soon as a planet ingresses into a new sign, every lunation chart, every lunation that occurs after that point, every solar return chart, every inception chart then has that sign placement baked into it. So, that's probably relevant here as well, where it's not that it's not tied into actual charts as soon as the ingress takes place, but in fact it starts being integrated into charts as soon as that ingress happens, whether you're sort of aware of it and paying attention to those charts or not. So that's probably relevant here as well. All right. So moving on, the other sort of preliminary topic, if you guys still want to do it at this point, we were going to mention briefly this debate on horary astrology that's come up over the past few days, where I didn't know. I should specifically pull up the page because I should cite him, but I was aware of this, that there was a sort of debate in the horary tradition where my observation like 10 years ago was that I thought there was a discrepancy between a lot of the older texts on horary, where some of the earliest like complete textbooks on horary astrology and asking horary questions, the surviving ones only go back into like the 8th and 9th century in the medieval Arabic tradition. And most of the questions in those texts are framed as the querent asking, will X happen in the future? Like, will I be married in the future? Or will I get this job? So it's a question about whether a specific event will or will not take place at some point in the future. And more recently in the modern tradition, the discrepancy that I noticed is that most of the questions are framed that way in the early horary tradition. But in the modern tradition, contemporary horary astrologers are much more comfortable taking questions that are framed more like, should I do X? So should I take this job, or should I get married to this person, or what have you, or sometimes choosing between option A and option B, like should I do option A or should I do option B? So it's a little bit more, it's not just that it's more free will oriented, but there's something different about the technical assumptions that are being made about how horary is being applied. And in noticing that discrepancy 10 years ago, I sort of sided more for conceptual and practical reasons with the earlier approach, where you should probably restrict horary to will X happen, because the majority of the way that you're asking most or answering most horary questions is by looking at the significators and whether they will perfect. So you look at like the ruler of the ascendant, which represents the querent, and then you look at the ruler of the house in question to see if that planet is applying towards the planet that represents the querent. And if they are moving towards an exact aspect, then it usually indicates an affirmative answer that those two things are coming together in the future. And if they're separating or not aspecting, that it indicates a negative answer because those things are symbolically not coming together in the future. And that therefore made more sense to me within the context of just a straightforward, will X happen in the future? So I thought, though, I was one of the only people who had that approach or had that viewpoint, but I've seen a debate both on Facebook and Twitter in the last few days where apparently there's more people who hold that view or that approach than I thought, whereas I thought in modern times that the prevailing viewpoint for most horary astrologers that I'm familiar with, which is mainly just the people that practice Renaissance astrology, they tend to be much more open to and saying that, should X happen questions are perfectly valid, and that's almost their preferred or more typical approach to horary at this point. Had you guys heard of this debate, or is this something you've thought about at all?
I think that's really interesting. I suppose I've approached that same set of questions for longer through tarot. One of the things that I commonly do is I'll do sort of a forked road sort of spread where I'm like, all right, well, if I go down this route, what does it look like? If I go, if I turn right here, or if I decide not to do that, what does that look like? And I guess I like that better than should with horary, because it's like, okay, so if this is the road that I go down, what does that road look like? If I go down this road, what does that road look like? Of course, you're going to get some answers with probably any divination system, which are like, you're not really going to go down that road, so stop asking dumb questions. But I think there's value to, look using your tools to look a little further down one route or another.
Yeah, I mean, so to answer your questions, Chris, I've never thought about this. So I'm sort of like, but I certainly have taken horary questions from clients as I'm thinking about it while you guys were talking. Most of the questions that come in by their nature are will I ever, will this happen in a certain time frame? Will this thing come together? But I do get a smaller group of clients who are wondering, should they do this or should they do that? Should I keep doing what I'm doing in whatever scenario, or should I make a change? And I guess even though the word should has been in the question, I've approached it probably similarly to the way you have used tarot, Austin, which is, okay, well, if you go down this path, this is what you'll be dealing with, which might be Saturn in detriment on the south node. So that's the energy if you go in that direction. And if you go in this direction, we've got Venus in dignity sextile Jupiter. So why? Because I guess the issue here is I don't really necessarily want to say to the client, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, because they can choose. Sometimes clients want to go down the more difficult route because they want the experience, they want to try it out, or they need to prove it for themselves. But I think from a divinatory perspective, which is really what horary is, there is that option to say, it looks more like smooth sailing, or things will come together more easily or with less effort in this direction. Whereas if you go in this path, you may not be successful, or you may just have to deal with some massive boulders along the way. And if there's an option to provide that information to a client, I think that can be really useful. So I would kind of use the tool that I have to provide what insight I could. Because I think there's something very sacred about the client presenting to the particular astrologer or healer or insightful person at a particular time. And I think there's something very powerful about how we connect with and either commit to the clients that we do and don't work with. So there's a very sacred thing when somebody shows up at your proverbial door, whether it's in your inbox or in your voicemail, and says, can you help me out with this thing? So yeah, that's sort of probably what I think about that.
Yeah, the divinatory duad.
Yes.
Right. And that's a tricky thing, because the astrologer is always implicated in the question with horary, because the question is, posed from the querent, but the astrologer is always the seventh house, or that's always been. And that's one of the reasons why some of those, considerations before judgment exist. Like if Saturn is in the seventh, because the astrologer might be making a mistake or something like that, as part of the implicit sort of notion underlying that consideration.
Of course. And there's I can't remember what the consideration is, but the one that says the client won't listen to what you tell them anyway. There's one based on do you guys know what I mean? There's a consideration where if this thing is happening in the chart, the client is unlikely to take on board whatever you say. Whatever it is that you're going to say, they're just not going to hear the info.
Right. Yeah. I forget if that's Saturn in the first or Saturn in the 10th. I mean, Saturn in the first is usually like, there's something wrong with the querent, or maybe they're not telling you the full story or something like that. So that could be it. The other is Saturn, I think in the 10th, that the outcome of the exchange of the question between the astrologer and the client is not necessarily good, or something negative happens as a result of that.
Totally.
Yeah. So let's see. Oh yeah, I meant to mention, so the genesis of this discussion was a post on Facebook, and it's this new book titled Horary Astrology, The Practical Way to Learn Your Fate, by Petros Eleftheriadis. And I'm really bad with Greek names, so are either of you better with Greek names than I am?
No.
No. All right. My apologies to Petros, but so he started this discussion because apparently he has a very strong objection to should I questions, which I was surprised at, because I thought I was one of the only people that even thought about that or took issue with that sort of approach. And then he's already, gotten quite a bit of pushback from other astrologers who are arguing against that and saying, should I questions are valid partially for philosophical reasons, because they want to emphasize free will and choice. and also appealing to the earlier tradition, like in William Lilly, where there are some questions like that. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of discussion topic. We don't need to linger on it too long today, but I just wanted to bring it up for people to think about, since it seems like, especially for horary practitioners, an interesting question to contemplate, because it really gets to the roots of what are you trying to do with horary. And if you don't know, the answer to that, then it can be very difficult to figure out which way to go with when presented with an issue or a question like that. All right. So I think that's it for preliminary stuff. Why don't we jump into the forecast? So we're 52 minutes into this episode, so I think that's good timing. Let's start from the very top then. What's the very first notable astrological event that happens in December of 2017, as far as you guys are concerned?
Mercury's retrograde station.
Okay, so it's already slowing down here in November. We're already in the shadow period as of a while ago, but that's your first thing, because that happens. It stations retrograde in late Sagittarius on December 3rd, right?
December 3rd in your time zone, late on the 2nd in mine.
Okay.
Saturday night.
Right.
How's that?
So that's right in Sag. And we talked about that a little bit last month, because, that means that Mercury, is stationing right next to Saturn, which is on its way out of Sagittarius and moving into Capricorn. And as a result of that, we're going to get a second conjunction with Saturn as Mercury is retrograde, I think later in the month. When is that, around the 22nd?
No, the Mercury conjoins Saturn retrograde on the 5th. And then will eventually conjoin Saturn once Saturn has crossed the boundary into Capricorn, but not until January.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
And it's worth noting that Mercury conjoins Saturn for the first time on the 27th of November, and then gets just past Saturn, stations retrograde early on the 3rd, late on the 2nd, and then conjoins Saturn again perfectly a few days later. So these details are useful, but it's also worth noting that Mercury will be within a degree of Saturn from, I think about like the 25th through the 8th, right? So we're basically looking at 2 weeks of Mercury conjunct Saturn very tightly.
Yeah. And you're so right, Austin, because we can all get Saturn in Virgo about the details, which we all love to do. But you
and I can.
We totally can, Austin. We can smash out those technicalities. But yeah, Mercury Saturn for basically 2 weeks. So there's this feeling of maybe mental pressure or, pushing hard to a deadline. When I was thinking about, December as part of my pre-show prep, I'm thinking Mercury Saturn. I'm like, there are documents, there are contracts, there are agreements that are being, put under the grind. Is this really going to hold up? Have we got it the right way? And then because we've got the station retrograde, it's that deep kind of review. This is a detailed pulling apart of agreements or contracts or commitments. And this, as much as Mercury will come back to Saturn, I think it's January 7th or 8th when they're both in Cap, there's something very unique just about this Mercury-Saturn Sag period that is kind of stands alone or, unto itself. It's significant. And the only extra tidbit that I'd throw in that's relevant, I think, to this piece is that on that same weekend, December 2 and 3, we have a full moon in one of Mercury's signs in Gemini, which I think is interesting because that will happen basically in the middle of that 2-week Mercury-Saturn period. So there really is this feeling about the data, the contracts, the ideas, and running the ideas or the deals through every check and balance, pushing it, testing it. How could this be attacked? How can we make it safe? I don't know if you guys would add to that, but it's definitely a unique period.
That I agree wholeheartedly with everything you said. I would embellish one of those points, which is the review aspect. So what's really interesting about this is that we've got Mercury station retrograde on Saturn 2.5 weeks before Saturn changes sign. And so it's natural when a planet has been in a position for a long time, with Saturn on and off for 3 years, that in the very last few weeks, we would review what happened, and how we dealt with it, right? And so Mercury, in this case, is really forcing this review. Mercury is focusing, is right on top of Saturn for weeks. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of like looking back on a personal level, looking back at the last couple of years, like, how you sort of a performance review with Saturn and Sagittarius, right? To what degree did it correspond with things you did on purpose, such as discipline you tried to enact? And how well did those work? To what degree did it correspond with things you simply had to endure? And how effective were your coping strategies for what you had to endure? There's a real review here. And then I had one other point that I wanted to add, which is that we have a pileup of things here which have the signification of slowness, right? Saturn is always the prime indicator for slowness, and Mercury grinding to a halt on top of Saturn. Certainly Mercury's cessation of apparent motion is an indicator for slowness, right? So we have like this double slowness right here, but it's in Sagittarius, which is one of the few signs which is explicitly connected with speed, right? There's no other sign which has a lower body specifically designed for transport, right? It's not like the fish are, it's like, or the sea goat, there's a really rapid animal. And so there's a certain frustration emanating from this, because there's like wanting to get it done, right? Especially with Saturn so late in the sign, with Mercury so late in the sign, wanting it to be over with, wanting whatever it is, but needing to spend a lot of time. I've been writing about this, and one of the images that came to mind was like speeding through the terrain until you hit a giant wall. And it's not that you can't tunnel under the wall. It's not that with the right ropes and pulleys and such that you couldn't climb the wall. It's not that there are no cracks in the wall, but it's going to take a little time. It's not something you just blaze through. And I think people's walls, the whatever fortifications they find themselves up against, will be different, but that there may be an experience which is parallel for a lot of people. Maybe it's a swamp rather than a wall, but something which creates slowness and requires that the path move from linear speed to exploratory, kind of finding the way through it.
Yeah, I think the wall's a great analogy because we've got the Saturn and the idea of station too. It's like stopping. Yeah. And then the feeling, as you were saying all that, Austin, the idea that came to my mind is like, it's like the galloping horse across the pasture and then coming to a halt. If there's a fence, and maybe it's a little higher than the horse is capable of jumping over. So if you've ever watched a horse get up to a fence that it can't immediately get past, it runs up and down the side of the fence for some time trying to figure out a way forward. And that is the feeling of those 2 weeks, is you are the horse, and instead of going forward, as you said, Austin, in a linear way, you are now going back and forwards in a sideways formation to try and figure out a way. And that's perhaps a good symbol for this idea of this energy of going over the same ground or treading water or taking it deeper with where you are.
I really like the horse analogy. Also, part of what you end up doing in this is mapping the boundary, which is very Mercury mapping.
Oh, that's a beautiful phrase.
And then, I was just thinking about the horse, and most fences are not 100% straight lines. And so not only are you no longer moving straight forward, you're following the contour of the boundary and trying to find the weak spaces. And who knows, maybe you're defending that boundary, and you're trying to keep stuff from getting in, and maybe you're aggressing. Maybe one of the images that came to mind when I was thinking about this was like sieging a fortress. right? You don't just march your army up to the gate, right? You can dig under the walls, you can try to widen cracks in the walls, but regardless, you kind of sit back and, you know, have to sit with and come to understand the structure before you can get through it. Or if you're defending that fortress, you know, you have to understand the weak points and maybe buttress those. But both of them, you know, those are just two understandings on opposite sides of the same boundary.
Totally.
Right. And one of the things that's weird here is, you know, Mercury in Sagittarius in and of itself, just as a placement, you would normally think of a placement where its issue is like communicating too much or talking too much or trying to do too much as like a typical issue or problem, or sometimes it's something that people with Mercury and Sagittarius are able to use to their benefit. Like, you know, one of my favorite Mercury and Sagittarius astrologers is like Rob Hand. And, you know, at any moment, Rob Hand could just like launch into a very long discussion that will have many like detours and like interesting anecdotes and side notes and things like that will last for like 30 minutes. And he's built up, like his lecture career is largely about that because it's usually very interesting when he goes on those kind of tangents. But this is an interesting placement because you have two separate things that are inhibiting Mercury from doing that. On the one hand, you have it hitting Saturn, which is usually like holding back or causing blockages or issues with communication. And then you have it stationing retrograde, which is essentially doing the same. Which, you know, pretty much just reinforces what you guys are saying. But I'm trying to think up of specific scenarios in which I would imagine, you know, Mercury having the inclination to want to go overboard. And that's part of why sometimes Mercury in Sagittarius is traditionally interpreted as a difficult placement or problematic placement for Mercury in terms of its usual significations, but then how that would work out in terms of it, you know, running into blockages and doing that, or perhaps having negative or challenging results as a result of that tendency.
The one thing that comes to my mind, because I was thinking too, like, what are some of the real life examples of this? Maybe you've got some paperwork that you need processed, or you're looking for an approval of something and you've submitted the documents and you're waiting impatiently for an answer. But what happened was that you submitted the documents either prematurely or they're incomplete. And it's
Right.
around this time that you get the feedback that whatever you're waiting on has been delayed, or that more paperwork is required.
Right. And then it takes longer than you expect.
It takes longer than you expect. Yeah, the delays come in because the paperwork is incomplete. It reminds me of when I had to fill out my permanent residency application here in Canada for the first time years ago, which was basically like doing a PhD on my relationship to prove that it was a genuine relationship. And I remember being told that if I, you know, obviously the person from immigration did not use these words, but they basically said you had to Saturn in Virgo the hell out of this, because if you ticked the wrong box or you used the wrong color pen, they would just send the application back and the whole 18-month thing starts over. So it's that kind of feeling where some small technicality or one small piece of information or data is missing or not where it should be, it's not where it should be, and that causes part of the delay or the problem.
Yeah, so as far as Mercury retrogrades generally corresponding to delays go, this one triply so.
Yeah, so this is going to be one of those type of Mercury retrogrades versus some of the other ones we were talking about, I think, earlier this year, where Mercury was like stationing with Neptune, and there was like, you know, issues of lack of clarity causing the issues, or when it's stationed with Uranus and some sort of unexpected disruption happened. This is more of the stationing with Saturn, you know, major delays and sometimes obstacles or errors that come up during the course of attempting to do mercurial things.
Yeah, definitely. I would also just say with Mercury being conjoined a malefic, Mercury will have bad news to deliver to some people. You know, Mercury communicates and is said to take on the qualities of the nature, or the qualities or the nature of the planets which it is conjoined to. And so, you know, what does Mercury have to say? Conjunct Saturn, it has, you know, Saturn's ideas to communicate, which might be like, you know, get better, you're not good.
Yeah.
I mean, I can also just see it being like kind of depressing. I mean, that's not the only thing that's going to happen, but as far as like what Mercury has to say when he is transmitting, when he's delivering Saturn's mail to you, there may, unpleasant communications will no doubt be a part of this set of stories.
Right. One of the things that's been tricky just over the past 2 weeks with Mercury, as it's already been in the same sign as Saturn, is it's been occurring after sundown, at least as the sun was in Scorpio. It was like if you had Gemini rising shortly after sunset, then it was like Mercury applying to Saturn, or Mercury in the same sign as Saturn ruling the ascendant, and that was causing some problems with elections during that time in terms of like attempts to make an offering or something to a seventh house party, but then being rejected or rebuffed in some sense because of Saturn being in the seventh house in the night chart, and just that concept of saying no or negating Mercury's significations.
Yeah, things being declined or turned down or rejected because, and I think this is where maybe the fact that Mercury is retrograde could, maybe if I stretch, I can spin this into a positive, that if it gets declined, so you say you make a pitch or a proposal and you send it off and you just get no, or it's not quite what we're looking for, doesn't match our audience, whatever. There's an opportunity, I think, to rework it and then resubmit. And so I don't know that I'd be doing that in this 2-week period because the message that Mercury is sending when it's on Saturn is more of a decline or, no thanks.
Now, I would be thinking on it during this 2-week period. One of the things that I get from this, if you wanted to move in harmony with this configuration, it's looking slowly, carefully, thoughtfully at the nature of a structure or a blockage or a wall, and really, like we said earlier, mapping the boundary. Like, so what is the nature of this limitation? I couldn't get through it when I tried to run through it, but maybe I need to slow down and think. Maybe I need to tunnel under it.
Right. Or sometimes you need a do-over, and sometimes that's hard and annoying. Like that's one of the archetypal like Mercury retrograde scenarios as well, that you initiate or you attempt to do something and it fails or it doesn't work out, or there's an error that does not allow it to be brought to completion, and then you have to do the whole process over again. And that's a very Saturnian type thing that I could see being emphasized here as well, is having to go through the hassle of having to do it again, once you get to the other side when Mercury's closer to stationing direct, and then eventually meeting with success or being able to bring to completion that which was blocked for whatever reason earlier in the cycle, closer to the retrograde station.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Totally.
And that full moon in a Mercury ruled sign in Gemini, day later, it just sort of turns up the volume on pretty much everything.
It does. And I believe that it's kind of square to Neptune.
So where's the full moon?
11, I think.
I think it's at 11. Yeah, come back a couple of hours.
Just for our audio listeners.
Yeah, so the full moon at 11 Gemini, and the sun and moon will be square Neptune at 11 Pisces. So as if that weekend, December 2nd and 3rd, wasn't already, got this weird sort of punctuation around it. We've got a little bit of Neptune in the mix. So maybe that just adds to the confusion, or it highlights that a way of dealing with whatever heavy mental or details thing is just to take an escape. I'm not sure exactly how people will navigate it, but it's definitely creating that seesaw.
Yeah, I would just not bank on swift, clear communications for that weekend. Don't put your eggs in that basket during that time period.
Right. Or if you do something and it doesn't work out, just, and you need to do it over again, just sort of get over that sooner than you might otherwise. Because sometimes like you could have a tendency to dwell on that and to be like, oh my God, I can't believe that didn't work. Or it didn't go through. But sometimes during the early phases of those Mercury retrograde periods, when that happens, you sometimes just need to kind of, I can't think of a better way to like submit to it and just go through the process and go through the motions. And sometimes that's all it's about.
Well, and I think the one concept, as you've been saying that, Chris, that really comes up for me is it's about quality control. And I always think that maybe the underlying intention of a Saturn transit or a Saturn aspect like this is that it is looking to weed out, lower quality specimens or projects or plans. And if something does get rejected, or as you say, you've got to go back over, maybe that's the Saturn in Virgo in me. It's like, you'll do it better the second time, and you'll have something that is more substantial, or that is stronger, or has more substance. So, yeah.
Right. The what doesn't kill you makes you stronger scenario.
Yeah. Or that, if you might have been really attached to it, but if it didn't quite hit the mark, put your energy into something that has more of a chance.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, sometimes, how do you guys give advice during those times? Because sometimes it's like you have scenarios where the person really has to start something, or they have to at least try during the early phase of Mercury stationing retrograde.
Oh, yeah.
And then it is sometimes it doesn't work out, and then they have to do it again. And then later, once Mercury is stationed direct, like 2 or 3 weeks later, then it goes through. But I'm often, met with an interesting question about, would it have been better to just put it off until 3 weeks later? Or did you need to go through that process? Was there something useful or sort of constructive about going through that process of like sometimes trying and failing and then trying again?
Well, I mean, both of those happen. I do find that a lot of times people think, myself included, that they absolutely have to do something by the station. And
right.
In retrospect, that was just being dumb.
Right. Or there's like this sense of urgency about it. But then later, once you look back and realize, and you look at all the troubles you went through, you realize you could have just put it off.
Yeah. A lot of, I love to put things off. It's half of the art of timing is racing to hit a particularly fertile piece of time. And then the other half is slowing yourself down and being like, you know what? Even though I would like the idea of this being accomplished by this date, that might be a product of my impatience rather than wisdom.
Right. Mm. I guess I sometimes just wonder, how much is it that versus like, I need to think deeply about this and whether I really do need to do this right now versus, are we just being neurotic at a certain point? If you're putting off some activities or some minor things until Mercury is not retrograde, it's sometimes there's a ambiguity about where to draw that line between what is, valid things that you could put off if you're thinking deeply about something versus what is it that is, that you should just do, and that this is not something that you need to wait until like an auspicious astrological alignment in order to accomplish.
Yeah, well, I think that the answer was encoded in the way that you phrased the question. The more important something is, the more seriously you should consider its timing. The less important something is, the less it matters.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the pieces of advice that I often do give to clients, because it's very common for me to get a lot of email queries or clients needing some reassurance or just insight. I've got to sign these documents, or I've got to make this submission, and Mercury is going to be retrograde or Mercury is stationing. And the piece of advice that I'll normally say is, look, if you have to do it, you have to do it. Mercury retrograde is not a terminal thing. It's more of a frustrating thorn in your side, stone in your shoe situation. Maybe this particular Mercury retrograde aside. But the practical piece of advice is, if you do have to submit something, particularly around the station retrograde, be proactive and follow up. Call or email 3 or 4 or 5 days later to make sure that what you sent got where it needed to go. So I think in those situations where you do have to go ahead, and I wrote a post on my blog earlier this year around Mercury retrograde in real estate, because I realized we actually bought our first home in the middle of a Mercury retrograde period. So we signed contracts to buy a house, we signed contracts to take on a mortgage with the bank, and we did all of this in the middle of a Mercury retrograde. And we held that house for 5 years, and it worked. It was fine. It did what it needed to do. So I think if you've got to go ahead, you've got to go ahead. But I do recall we were actually traveling internationally, and the paperwork for this deal had to get faxed to a hotel, and it was very complicated getting the paperwork to the right place at the right time. So you can certainly work with it. I don't think it has to be an absolute preventative. But as we're saying, even to go back to the pre-show discussion around, this is the astrological weather, so be mindful and maybe adapt your strategy accordingly.
Yeah, I really like that advice, Kelly, the follow-up. I would also say, if it has to do with signing things, read the fine print. Make yourself read the fine print. Somebody says, it'll be fine.
Totally.
Right. I would add to that, if you got to initiate something important near a Mercury retrograde station, be adaptable moving forward. Don't be shocked if there are some changes. Sometimes the Mercury retrograde, it's not that everything is totally reversed and what you thought was wonderful is terrible. It's just that there's a certain instability and things get a little wiggly and they might look a little different than what you thought they were going to look like. It might not be horrible, but, Mercury is not in a stable or stabilizing position during that part of its phase. And so just, setting expectations accordingly.
Sure. And that full moon that you guys mentioned early on the 3rd at 11 degrees of Gemini, that really does put even more focus on that Mercury station there at 29 Sagittarius around the same time.
Hell yeah.
And also the Saturn getting ready to leave that sign, in the sense of this being one of the last sort of final culminations of what Saturn and Sagittarius has been about. And both in a reflective sense, probably for some people, in terms of taking stock of what that transit has been about, both collectively as well as individually for a lot of people over the past 2.5, almost 3 years. But then also sort of an intensification of like one last Saturn and Sagittarius type event that gets amped up by Mercury stationing there with the full moon in a Mercury ruled sign, and a sort of intensification of that last bit of Saturn and Sagittarius, like Austin was saying.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what it'll look like on a mundane and political level. I don't think it will be a quiet December. Just to tie this into a very simple thing, which is just looking at the balance of planets in signs of different elemental qualities. As December begins, we have 4 planets in Sagittarius. Uranus is still in Aries. The North Node is still in Leo. We've got quite a bit of fire in play. And although it won't be moving into a fire sign, Mars is moving into arguably its strongest place in the zodiac.
Yeah.
Shortly after the first full week of December ends, where we have Mars moving into Scorpio. Is it on the 8th?
I think it's around the 8th. Yeah.
That looks like the 9th. Okay. Or maybe it's night on the 8th.
It's like late on the 8th, early on the 9th.
Okay, great. Mars will not be in a fire sign, but Mars inarguably has a distinctly fiery quality.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a lot, as far as the stage being set for rancor publicly, I expect there to be some public brawls in December, more so than the sort of average level of contentiousness which we live with right now. A spike from the baseline of a contentious time.
Well, it's interesting how much of Jupiter in Scorpio up to this point, so it'll be at like 12 degrees of Scorpio by the time we get there to December 9th, how much, even though it's been bringing up terrible things in the news, that there's been more of a general theme across all of them as seeking justice for past misdeeds and like past misdeeds being brought to light for the sake of justice or healing or other sort of keywords for that. That's been more of a sort of positive process for many people, obviously. Yeah,
Jupiter's ingress into Scorpio and time in Scorpio didn't time the when these acts were committed. This is timing. This is one of the factors involved in timing the exposure. The exposure is creating more justice, not less. right? So we see Jupiter's, fundamentally benefic quality there. Exposing bad things is a way of turning them into good things.
Right. And so, but with Mars, ingressing into Scorpio late on the 8th and early on the 9th, it seems to bring more of like a contentious or like conflict filled type quality and a sort of intensity to that area and to that transit, which then builds up over the course of the month as Mars gets closer and closer to actually conjoining Jupiter in Scorpio. So I'm curious if that will change the nature of some of the discussions that have been happening up to this point.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that Mars is considerably more punitive than Jupiter, especially in Scorpio. And, by the way, a fun essential dignity note, for Mars's time in the first several degrees of Scorpio, it has every dignity except exaltation. It's the triplicity ruler, it's the ruler, it's in its own bound, and it's in its own decan.
Wow.
Yeah, and so that's it's peak Mars.
I like that. But I do think you guys are right that we're getting this sort of more military, or, it's not Mars and Aries aggressive, but there is this sort of drive or sense of what are we going to do about all of this stuff that has been coming out? And will there be punishments that are handed down? And I think just from the simple timing, we've got in December, Mars coming into Scorpio and having that peak, lots of dignity. But it may be in January when Mars actually catches up to Jupiter, which will be around the time of its sextile to Pluto, that we might get, the real stirring of the pot, so to speak.
Okay, there it is. So it's about 17 degrees of Scorpio around January 6th or 7th. That's where Jupiter and Mars conjoin.
Yeah. And then we've got that sextile to the Sun, Pluto. So that feels like, part of the Mars and Scorpio story might peak or, come to its full intensity through that period.
Got it. I'm just animating it to see. It looks like it happens at 17:55 Scorpio on January 6th. So okay, so that's going to be one of our that's obviously one of our major trends this month is Mars ingressing into Scorpio. And then, of course, later in the month, which we'll talk about, I think we have to put off a little bit longer, Saturn ingresses into Capricorn. So we've got two major ingresses taking place. But just to back up a tiny bit to the very top of the month, the very first transit that actually happens is that Venus ingresses into Sagittarius on December 1st. So that's one of the sort of early transits happening at the beginning of the month. Simultaneously on December, or almost simultaneously on December 2nd, Jupiter exactly trines Neptune. So that Jupiter-Neptune trine is actually one of the stronger or more prominent, even though it's not a hard aspect, it's one of the more prominent outer planet sort of alignments that's happening at the very, very beginning of the month. And that's a little interesting, or might be a little bit more pertinent, because it's tied into that first lunation that we have, where the full moon occurs at 11 degrees of Gemini, and that's exactly squaring Neptune. And then Neptune is pretty closely trining Jupiter at that point.
Yeah, the Jupiter trine Neptune aspect, it's actually one of, I think, only two outer planet aspects that Jupiter and Scorpio makes. We've just got the trine to Neptune this December, and then we get the sextile to Pluto in 2018. So it's significant, I think, in the context particularly of the Jupiter and Scorpio story. This is the first time we get Jupiter and Scorpio interacting with a more outer planet. I'm interested to see what floodgates might open, whether there is more that comes out of down the Jupiter and Scorpio pipeline. But I also think this is a Jupiter-Neptune combination, and there is some kind of healing or emotion or compassion or soulfulness or sensitivity that strikes me as coming forward from this, whether that's about finding meaning through compassion or healing people through water or energetic stuff. I think there's maybe a soft side to this that might be a nice counterpoint to a lot of the other energy in that early December period. But I'm very curious to hear particularly what you think, Austin.
I agree. I think that one of Neptune's primary actions in this will be to soften Jupiter and Scorpio a little bit. Jupiter and Scorpio feeds growth or the expansion of understanding via revelation and acceptance of things which are ugly or dark. And Neptune is very much about acceptance. And sometimes forgiveness, just, bigger, vast understanding. Neptune's orbit encloses all the rest of the planets. So in a sense, it creates a space big enough for all of them. I don't think this will be, I consider this a background factor. I consider it a pleasant one, but I don't think it's a particularly event-producing configuration.
Mm-mm.
I think it just sort of softens Jupiter. And it's not that Jupiter isn't trine Neptune now.
Yes, exactly. Late November, it's coming in.
Yeah, so, again, it's worth noting. And, I think poor Venus's entrance into Sagittarius is going to be completely overshadowed by the Mercury-Saturn business, as well as the moon in Gemini. I mean, it's a slight difference in tone, and it's another planet in a fire sign, and so there's a slight difference in affect with Venus in Sag versus Venus in Scorpio, but I don't see it being one of the star players of this month.
Sure, and I was just mentioning it because I wrote it down on my list of just what ingresses are taking place this month to hit them sort of chronologically. Is this the first of 3 Jupiter-Neptune trines? Are we going to get 3 of them, or does it not quite happen?
I'm going to double check.
I mean, it's like I would assume we're going to get 3 of them, but I don't know how far back Jupiter is going to retrograde.
I think the direct station is really close.
It's station direct is at 13 Scorpio in July, and Neptune at that time will be
16.
We are going 16, yeah. So we will get a trine in August, yeah. Jupiter, Neptune, and then we'll have a retrograde hit in May, 16. Yeah, so this is the first of 3.
It's part of the background for really most of the next year.
Yeah.
Right. It's hard with those sort of easy types of transits between relatively, easy, I don't know, can't think of a better word, but easy planets, because it's hard to generate, or they don't typically generate many sparks. And so there's not much to really focus on when it comes to them, but it's sort of an interesting background transit that will be present as something that's unique about this Jupiter transit through Scorpio that wouldn't be true about other Jupiter transits through Scorpio.
Right.
Totally.
Well, so speaking of Scorpio, let's say some more things about Mars time in Scorpio, because we talked about how it may affect ongoing Jupiterian themes on a collective level. But this is Mars again. This is primetime Mars, and it's there until for most of January. And so if you do well with Scorpio stuff and you like Mars stuff, like I do, I love it when Jupiter's in Scorpio or when Mars is in Scorpio. It feels fantastic. I have like more than enough energy to do everything I dream of doing. I tend to be really good about my whatever exercise routine I'm doing. If you like pretending you're a freight train, Mars and Scorpio can be really good for that.
Right.
Whereas
Robert Zoller told me once, the analogy he used, he said that Mars in Aries is like a machine gun, whereas he said that Mars in Scorpio is like a sniper rifle, or that's the analogy that he used, at least.
Yeah, I think that's interesting and true in some senses. That one of my go-tos was ninja versus samurai. Like, I will meet you out in the open field, Aries, versus I will kill you at night. But in terms of the how I experienced the shift in energy levels with Mars and Scorpio, I definitely get the fixed water, like having a consistent fixed river of power, like just carrying you forward towards your goals. But because Mars is a malefic, and because Mars is a malefic, it's very different to be on the receiving end of Mars versus the acting end of Mars. And so people tend to have extremely polarized experiences around powerful malefics, right? And that's true in natal charts as well as by transit. And so,
Right.
you know, I would probably, if you have some knowledge of astrology, you know, go on Planet Watcher and just look at the last 2 or 3 times that Mars was in Scorpio and ask yourself whether you liked that or whether you disliked it. Because you probably have a very consistent response to that energy input.
And just for those who might need a quick guide, Mars was last in Scorpio from January 3rd, 2016 until early March 6th, 2016. That was a little bit of a unique situation because we had the retrograde, but at least it'll give you a taste for sure.
Right. And then 2 years before that, and then 2 years before that, and then 2 years before that.
Yeah.
Reaching for my handy ephemeris, or
I'm
strategically
going to have
placed
to replace
ephemeris.
this one. I'm going to have to replace it for the second time.
What have you done to that poor thing? What's happening on the front?
Well, that was the Egyptian terms and they've fallen apart. I've lost half, you know, I stop at, you know, Mercury's terms in Leo and I got nothing underneath that. I've had to put a copy inside.
That reminds me of like Ptolemy's story, the story about like finding his set of new terms or bounds, where he says he found an ancient, very tattered manuscript that had a different set of bounds, and everyone's kind of assumed that he was making it up the whole time, but this is actually making me think otherwise. Maybe he just found
like,
there was an
he found
equivalent,
it and he had to fill in the blanks.
Right. There was an equivalent of like a Kelly Surtees at the Library of Alexandria, and she slapped her terms on her ephemeris and carried it around, and then it fell apart.
Yes, it fell apart. Well, I mean, it's very handy to have them all together.
Right.
So now I've had to put them inside. Anyway, you just made me laugh. And people should know we do use books. I mean, as much as we have our great software, this is fantastic.
Yeah, that's one of my top. I did a video on, you know, like top, I think 6 book recommendations for new astrologers. And one of them is buy, you know, a print ephemeris and start reading it regularly and learning how to use it.
Absolutely. It's so critical. I will just say one quick thing on Venus in Sag. I know she gets quite overshadowed, but Venus is in Sag for most of December. And this is a happier vibe than Venus in Scorpio. So from a Venus perspective, she's just a bit lighter. I know she's in the sign with Saturn and et cetera, but I'd rather have her in Sag than in Scorp, I think.
Yeah, one of the things in the last webinar I did with the Hellenistic course, we went and read through the earliest surviving delineations of how astrologers would interpret planets in signs of the zodiac. And one of the things that was pretty consistent is that their primary interpretive principle was looking at the planet and then looking at what the ruler of that sign is and then interpreting or merging their significations together. And that became then the reason why Venus in Scorpio was interpreted as more problematic in some instances, is because it was interpreted as Venus being given significations from Mars, and Mars's significations often being contrary to her own, versus, you know, Venus transiting through Sagittarius and being given significations from Jupiter, and that being a little bit brighter, let's say, than significations from Mars and Scorpio.
Well, and it's a more comfortable fit because Venus and Jupiter have more similar qualities. If we just think benefic, heat and moisture, yeah, you know, Mars being dry, Venus perhaps being moist or what have you. Yeah, that's right. So it is a background influence. I didn't necessarily need to push it to the front, but I think it's going to be nice. I'm looking forward to Venus shifting into Sag.
Yeah, definitely.
Should we move to like the second half of the month? I know we're like, this is so exciting what's happening the first half, but
yeah, it looks like we're getting, I guess we're an hour and a half into this, so we should press forward and get out of the first week of...
the first 4 days of December.
Right. Okay, so it looks like on our list, so we've got the retrograde, we've got the full moon in Gemini on the 3rd, and then eventually we have the Mercury conjunct Saturn, which takes place December 6th.
And that's 2 of 3.
Right. 2 of 3, and then the 3rd will take place in Capricorn.
Yeah.
The following month, and we've talked about Mars ingressing into Scorpio on December 9th, and so that brings us, actually the only thing I have written down doesn't take place until like 9 days later, and that's the new moon in Sagittarius. Is there anything I'm overlooking there?
The only thing I've got is that on the 12th Eastern time, it'll be the 12th for you guys as well, the sun is conjunct Mercury, so just that phase shift with Mercury retrograde conjunct the sun. I think Unless you would add anything else to that mid-month period, Austin.
That's hugely important. So the midpoint in the Mercury retrograde phase is when Mercury is retrograde and it conjoins the sun, and that's the halfway point in the retrograde cycle. And so that takes place on the 12th.
Yeah, I've got it on the 12th, 8:48 p.m. Eastern. So that would be 6:48 for you, Chris, I think.
Yeah, that looks about right. So it happens at about 21 degrees of Sagittarius.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay. Anything else? Did you notice anything else that we're overlooking, Austin, between the ingress of Mars into Scorpio on the 9th and the new moon in Sagittarius on the 18th?
Not in particular. There is a Mercury-Venus conjunction. What day is that?
Yes. That is on the 15th at 9:08 a.m. So 7:08 a.m. for you, Chris.
How do you have the times? Do you have
I printed, I was just writing up a blog post this morning for December. So I printed this from SolarFire.
Okay. So you generate all not just the dates, but also the times from a SolarFire report?
Yeah. It's just the dynamic report that it's totally default. It comes out with the times, the date, the time, even the position in the zodiac. So, Mercury's conjunct Venus, 15th of December, 9:08 a.m., 17 Sag. One's retrograde, one's direct.
Okay.
It's very detailed.
Yeah, I'm still new to the ways of generating general transit reports and stuff that I'm learning.
And I just started, I knew about them, but I just started using them, and it's just so much more efficient.
Sure.
So we can debrief off afterwards if you want.
Yeah, no, I'll have to get you to do a tutorial. Maybe we could do a tutorial video and we could record it for YouTube and show people how to use SolarFire to generate that or something.
Totally. Yeah, it's the kind of thing that when I meet with clients in person, when the client knows a little bit about astrology, I would give them, a year's worth of big stuff. Anyway.
Sure. Okay, so that Mercury-Venus conjunction takes place on December 15th at 17 degrees of Sagittarius.
Yes, they will. Yeah. Yes.
And then, so the next thing after that then would be the new moon in Sagittarius. And when does that take place?
That one I do not have a time for because I did not do lunations. You got it.
Yeah, it looks like it's very late on the 17th, for at least here in Denver.
Yeah, I might have it. Here we go. I do have it on a different page.
So it's at 26 degrees of Sagittarius is the new moon in Gemini. So it's right there with this huge cluster, pileup of planets in Sagittarius, where Saturn is still there at 29:46 Sag, Venus is at 21, and Mercury is still retrograde at 15 Sag. So that is the new moon in Sagittarius right in the middle of the month.
Yes. Yeah, and so it'll be the 17th, you guys, 18th over here and in Oz. Just before the solstice, just before Saturn ingresses. So that lunation, that the next 4 weeks after this new moon, that's when we have the Saturn ingress.
Right. It's so interesting that you have a new moon there and then Saturn is still there, but it's getting ready to leave the sign. So it's like the first new moon in Sag that's almost free of that Saturn transit, although it's not really free at this point because it's still barely in the sign.
Yeah, and I think because the moon is then just going to go straight from the conjunction with the sun to the conjunction with Saturn. I mean, that's quite a maltreated moon, is it not?
Okay, right. Yeah, good point. What do you think, Austin?
I agree. I mean, I think that new moon is, how should we say, of the theme that we delineated earlier, which is this reviewing Saturn just before it leaves, right? We had Mercury stationed there, and then we have a new moon there, and then it's going to leave. And then we're going to enter this new Saturn and Capricorn phase. Mere, what, like a day after the new moon?
Yeah, two days. It looks like almost exactly 2 days later, Saturn makes its ingress into 00 Capricorn.
Yes. Yeah, because I've got the 20th is when the ingress happens.
That's pretty wild. So yeah, it's like those two lunations are really the two last of the last gasps of Saturn and Sagittarius, reminding us of what it's all about and giving one more one more hit before it makes its way into the next sign and leaves Sagittarius for the next, 27 some odd years.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, and this will show up in Horary, is that we have the Sun very close to conjunction with Saturn, but the Sun doesn't complete its conjunction with Saturn until just after Saturn has moved across that boundary. That conjunction will be complete and perfect in Capricorn, even though it looks like it's just about to happen in Sagittarius. And that on a sort of a transit experiential level, that's like sitting and looking at something and thinking about, the nature of your responsibilities, obligations, your discipline and all that, and getting closer to it. But when you actually reach it, when you get as close as you're going to get, when you get your fullest view, it will be from a very different angle, right? It'll be that Capricorn angle. And so we really have the old, the old becoming, the old boss becoming the new boss by the time you actually arrive at the meeting.
Yes. And so it's the idea that something has changed form or substance or shape by the time you get there, because as you were approaching it for quite some time, you were seeing the Saturn in Sag version. And by the time you get there, what you get is Saturn in Capricorn. Very, very different.
So let's talk about...
Hold on, I just pulled up a chart. So this is an example, actually. If you had like a Horary chart during that time where you had Leo rising and the Sun is the ruler of the ascendant, so it would represent the querent, and you have Aquarius on the 7th house, so it would represent, let's say if it was a relationship question, like, will I get in a relationship with X? And the Sun is down there at 26 Sag, and it's applying within 3 degrees to Saturn at 29. Mm-hmm. So it's like normally that would be a yes answer to the question. But then, like you said, Austin, Saturn moves into Capricorn before the conjunction can be completed. So there's going to be a few Horary questions or even electional charts or other things during that time that'll have that specific configuration.
Yeah, where it's gonna end up different than what it looks like.
Right. And so this is actually called evasion in Abu Mashar. So he defines it. So this is from Charles Burnett's translation. He says, evasion is if there's a planet A going towards application to another planet B, and before it reaches it, the planet B to which it is applying removes to another sign. Then, since the pushing planet A changes sign, if another planet C is closer to it A than to B, then its application is to the other planet C, and its application to the first planet B is aborted. So then it becomes a question of, does another planet catch up with and perfect the aspect with Saturn before the Sun catches up to it in the new sign? And if so, then the question ends up being no. But if the sign is able to make a clear application to Saturn before other planets catch up to it, then the answer might still be yes, even though there'll be a change of circumstances because of the change of signs.
Totally.
Sure. So, anyway, just, connected with the whole Horary theme.
I was going to say we're totally on the Horary theme tonight. It's fantastic.
Which is sort of relevant because then, this would be one of those answers where I'm trying to think of a scenario because, the will I scenario is very clear here. It's like, will me and this person get married, let's say? Yeah. And then you're looking at the application of those two planets, and if they're going to complete the aspect in the future, then the answer is yes. If they're not, or if the aspect is destroyed for some sense or aborted, then the answer ends up being no. Whereas if it was more of like a should I question, then you have a question of how would you interpret this chart if it's like, should I get into a relationship or should I marry this other person?
Yeah,
so we don't have to go there, but that would be the actual, in very technical terms, the terms of the debate or the difference.
Yes. And we probably should do a show on Horary because we clearly all have a lot to say there.
Sure. Yeah, we'll do that at some point. I haven't done much on Horary. I did finally do one show introducing it with Lee Lehman this summer, but I've been meaning to do some follow-ups.
Yeah, Horary's fun. So we have to talk about Saturn going into Cap.
Yeah, I think it looks like we are at that point. So after the new moon in Sagittarius on December 18th, then as Austin said, it's just like a day or so later that Saturn moves into Capricorn around December 19th.
Yeah. So this is really the news, not just of the month, but of the quarter. Or
how long is it there for? When's the final ingress out of Capricorn?
Oops, it's 3 years, and I'll get you the final ingress date from my ephemeris that doesn't have terms on it. It leaves Capricorn for good in December 2020. It will pop in and out throughout 2020, but it does not. It leaves for the final time in December, almost 3 years to the date, like the 17th of December 2020 is what.
Okay. So this is going to be a full-fledged, like 3-year transit of Saturn through this sign?
Yeah, usually Saturn does spend 3 years. Like when it first went into Sag, it was early 2015, and it's leaving now for the final. Like you do have to think about it, particularly when doing a whole sign transit or what have you, like Saturn's in Sag and that's my ex house. You do have to think. I find clients have to think about that 3-year window.
Yeah, that's just something I meant to, and I don't think I emphasized in the Saturn Returns episode that, you know, the starting date is the first time that it ingresses into the sign, even if it retrogrades out and comes back in.
Correct.
And then the final ending date is the last time it leaves that sign, even if previously it had left the sign and then comes back in. It's the final time and the first time that really count as the bookends to that period.
Totally.
Sure. All right. So I know that we're going to do a whole separate episode, or at least that was the plan. And Austin, you said that you were hoping we could put it off until January to give it a little bit of time to percolate. But we'll still plan on doing like a full Saturn and Capricorn episode here before too long.
Yeah, I want to do it. We don't have to wait all the way, although we don't have to wait until January, but I would like Saturn to have entered Capricorn before we sit down.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense, or I've become much more comfortable with that, because I forgot that when we did the last Saturn and Sag episode, we did it had ingressed in late 2014, early 2015, and then it retrograded back into Scorpio, and then it went back in, and it was when it went back in the second time that we actually recorded the Saturn and Sag episodes. We had already started to get some sense of what that was going to be about, and I think that makes sense in this context as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys, though, have already started seriously thinking about this and writing articles and doing your research. So how are you feeling about this? Or have you started to get a sense? Austin, I know you were coming up with some really good keywords already for this transit as like an overall sort of like a meta interpretation, right?
Yeah, I have some things. I'm not satisfied with what I have yet. I mean, one of the difficult things about Saturn, interpreting Saturn in Capricorn, is just differentiating it from raw Saturn, because it's so raw Saturn in the way that people think about Saturn. Mm-hmm. Saturn is also in its rulership and equally strong in Aquarius, but I think people tend to associate more the Capricorn side of Saturn's significations with the planet itself. It's everything that you associate with Saturn: limitations, boundary, responsibility, building things to last, enduring, strengthening, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of these qualities apply in spades to Saturn and Capricorn. It has, there's an ability to, Saturn punishes, right? Saturn and Capricorn will certainly punish. Saturn and Capricorn is also the sturdiest of support, right? It's those structural dynamics where you get with Saturn, where you can be trapped by a structure, or you can be empowered or protected by a structure. And fortunately, or not, the week after Saturn's ingress really gives us a chance to both see and feel it. The sun, when the sun crosses the boundary from Sagittarius into Capricorn, which is the equinox, the solstice, it immediately encounters Saturn. Yes. Right, and that's the beginning end of the Sun-Saturn synodic cycle, right? That's the new moon in a sense for Saturn. And so there's, the sun's just looking right at Saturn and vice versa. So there's a really, I think, nice opportunity to just sit back and look and see what there is to see. And then a few days later on Christmas, we have Venus conjunct that Saturn in Capricorn.
Yeah.
And so that's a chance to feel it. It may not be the most joyous Christmas configuration, but taken as an opportunity to understand the direction that things are going in, and a seed pattern that will have that will unpack itself over the next 3 years. Those two subsequent conjunctions, I think, provide us an opportunity. And to add to something that we've said a number of times about watching an outer planet's ingress on a mundane level, looking for early events which signify themes. I always do that on a personal level as well. There's usually, it's like, okay, that will be Saturn moving from my 6th into my 7th. What is that going to look like? Right.
And sometimes you'll start seeing events happening like right away, but sometimes they're really subtle if you're not paying attention to it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that you will probably only glean any wisdom from in retrospect if you're not paying attention, if you're not making an effort to pay attention.
Right. I mean, occasionally it's not always subtle. I mean, some people it's going to be very prominent, like if that's activated by annual profections already, or it's like moving into a prominent part of the chart. But yeah, as a long-term, like 3-year transit, sometimes it's a good idea to start paying attention to those little changes, just little subtle changes that start happening in your life at that time, because sometimes they'll snowball into much larger themes before you know it.
Yeah. And so, just looking at the chart of the last third of the month, where we have Saturn in Capricorn and Mars in Scorpio, we have two be-strong malefics. Both of the malefics are in signs that they rule. They're very powerful there. And what's interesting is we have the benefics in the signs of the malefics. We have Jupiter in Mars's sign Scorpio and Venus in Saturn's sign Capricorn, which is... I'm just noticing that, so I don't have any tremendous insights into it. But anyway, Kelly, what do you think about Saturn and Capricorn?
Yeah, look, like you, Austin, I almost feel a little premature on my Saturn and Cap thoughts. They're not fully formed, but it is.
Have you been reading up on this? Like, what's your process, Kelly? Like, do you go back and look at past instances? Do you look at client charts? Like, what's your process? Because I know both of you are writing like your Saturn and Capricorn columns at this point, right? Right, Kelly?
Yes, absolutely. And I've already written horoscopes for next year that I've got Saturn in Capricorn. One of the first things that I do to get a feel for it, because that's what I need, is I look back to the last time Saturn was in Capricorn, or the last few times, so I'm starting with the collective, if you like, or the big picture before making it personal. And of course, the last time that Saturn was in Capricorn was from early 1988 to early 1991. Now, that was a unique time because Saturn was in Capricorn with Uranus and Neptune. And we had the collapse in the Eastern Bloc states in Europe and the Soviet. We had the wall come down. Like, there was a huge sort of shift in Europe at that time.
Right. But a lot of mundane astrologers associate that transit with that as one of the primary mundane things.
Totally. And I do recognize it wasn't just a pure Saturn in Cap energy, because Saturn was there with Uranus and Neptune, which is highly unusual. Yeah, go, Austin.
I was just going to say, that's precedents are always important. And I don't like that, because that's it's dirty data, because there's so much else going on.
Totally.
One thing, if you just look at Saturn and Capricorn in the 20th century for the United States, it's not good. It's not good for money.
And I think that's not even unique to the US. That's a collective thing. I think Saturn in Cap Saturn is a contraction energy. It
Absolutely.
restricts things, it limits things. Capricorn represents banking institutions and the financial foundations that our society operates on. Whether you agree with it or not, we all live in a society in which the banking systems have a huge amount of power and influence. And I do think collectively we will see, tightening of credit. We will see tightening and increased limitation or regulation around borrowing. And I also think one of the collective areas we will see that contraction in is around real estate and property. I think how we experience that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in some areas there are bubbles. I mean, there are parts of Sydney, there are parts of Vancouver that are just priced out for the average person on, even whatever the median wages are. And I think to go back to one of the other themes of our ongoing conversation tonight is that how it shows up collectively and how you experience it personally will be different. That while I'm saying Saturn in Capricorn can have a collective impact on banking and finance, if Saturn in Capricorn isn't somehow connected to your personal second house or your personal eighth house of money, it may be that it's got nothing to do with money for you personally. So you do want to filter in, these are the collective big picture symbols and themes, but if it's Saturn in Cap as seventh house for you, this has got a hell of a lot more to do with your commitments and obligations to other people, how you conduct yourself in partnerships, that type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, totally. Just to, really quick review. So Saturn's in Cap, Saturn enters Cap late 29, early 30s, right? So there's the beginning of the Great Depression. And then it goes in again, the end of the 50s, early 60s. There's an economic downturn in the United States. It's not epic, legendary, or historical. And then you have another small recession, early 90s with Saturn and Cap. And so for the United States, it's not that those are very different in degree, right? Like the downturn in the early 60s.
Oh no.
Did we lose him?
Yeah.
Hi, it just popped in and out again. That was strange. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Is Zencastr still going?
I don't know. Let me check. But what I was just saying is that, you do have a consistent correspondence with economic downturns or contractions in the United States with Saturn and Capricorn, but the degree of those downturns is very different depending on which previous instance you're looking at. Yeah,
yes.
Right. Well, I mean, and if you're using, I actually don't really have a preference on the U.S. chart, but it's funny that you're mentioning that stuff, since of course with the Sagittarius rising chart that you were mentioning earlier for the U.S., Capricorn would be the second house, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting that Saturn puts pressure on the United States benefics in early Cancer. The U.S. chart, or the declaration chart, has a Venus Jupiter in early Cancer, and so that puts Saturn and Capricorn in a position to oppose them early on in its time there. And that's a factor that Ray Merriman has done some nice work on. But basically, when you get multiple stressful, malefic things that are going to be around for a while, targeting America's benefics in that declaration chart, you generally have economic problems.
For sure. I think there's one particular article that I would happily share with our listeners, which has formed part of my own research for this. I didn't write it, so I don't want to take any credit for this, but it's written by the Mundane Australian astrologer Ed Tamplin. His most recent weekly column, he does a full treatment of Saturn in Capricorn, and he's got some amazing historical notes here. Just to quickly mention a couple of things, he says the US Federal Reserve is also a Capricorn sun chart, as the act was signed off on by Wilson on December 23, 1913 at 16:02 p.m. The sun for the US Federal Reserve is right at the very start of Capricorn, opposite Pluto in Cancer.
That makes sense.
So that's significant. Ed is just wonderful for his historical references. He talks about, he's gone back to the 1500s, 1517 to 1520, when Saturn was in Capricorn with Pluto in Capricorn. So he's done exactly what we're talking about, Austin, where he's looked specifically not just for Saturn in Cap, but Saturn in Cap plus Pluto in Cap. And he talks about that period in the mid 16th century or the early 16th century about Magellan going off on his round the world tour, sort of reshaping, as you said, mapping the boundaries earlier. And what's interesting about that period between 1517 and 1520 is we also had Uranus going into Taurus, or Uranus in Taurus at that time, which is another one of the unique signatures that we will be dealing with as we get into 2018. So I'm happy to get you that link, Chris, if you want to post it in the show notes, or we can share it with people if people just want to look at it. He's done like the research there would probably take me half an hour to go through all of it. Things about different banks, the Bank of New York, how they're all connected to this sort of Saturn in Capricorn cycle.
What's his website again?
So it's edtamplin.com, and it's the November 19 weekly horoscope column.
Okay, good. Yeah, people should check that out at edtamplin.com, because he has, or at least he used to have, just like a running list of his latest articles, basically, right?
Yeah. Yes, he has had that, and he's been a little unwell this year, I think, but he's still, I don't know if he's got the running tally, but he's still putting out his regular columns that are amazing.
Yeah, it is really great. He actually wrote a really nice, kind review of my book in the FAA Journal earlier this year. So one of the things I wanted to mention is, of course, one of the differences between, back to the beginning of this conversation, when you were bringing up how the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Saturn was in Capricorn, was such a unique configuration because it had Uranus and Neptune there at the same time. And then the one, of course, that astrologers keep coming back to that's unique about this one is Pluto being there, and Saturn gradually catching up to Pluto over the course of the next couple of years before conjoining it. And while on the one hand, with some of the different things that you guys are talking about, on the one hand, Pluto can be associated with this process of things breaking down and decay and transformation. There's also like this other side of Pluto, which is more about the consolidation of power. And I'm not sure that that's not the direction that it's going to go in a number of these areas as well, where instead of seeing the breakdown of some of these structures that are built into society, in other instances, you're going to see this real consolidation and things that are already powerful drawing more power or sucking more power into them and starting to wield that power in different ways. So I don't know, that's a theme I keep coming up with, because sometimes I see astrologers talk very optimistically about the breakdown of bad existing structures in society, but I wonder about that Pluto transit and sometimes hardening some of them in some instances.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Chris, the idea of consolidation of power. And as much as, maybe it's odd for me to say this considering the perspective I often take, I do think we're going to see destruction of power centers, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily going to always be a good thing.
Right. What do you think, Austin?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts about this. So let me reduce those into a few statements, and we'll talk about it more when we do our Saturn and Pluto, or Saturn talk.
Yeah, we'll do a whole 2 hours on that.
Right. So I think that Pluto in Capricorn is at this point pointing towards zombie institutions, which are operating on a logic that may have made sense 60 or 150 years ago, but has become increasingly irrelevant to the current state of things. I think that which is out, this can be seen in other countries, in other regions of the world, but in the United States right now, with the United States having Pluto in Capricorn in its natal chart, we can see that the U.S. education system, healthcare system of taxation, as well as a number of other large, not to mention justice system, all of these.
That's a good one. Patrick Watson said that Saturn and Capricorn has a lot to do with prisons as well.
Yeah, I don't think it'd be justice, but the imprisonment process.
Well, that's what they call technically. Ironically, the prison industrial complex is referred to as part of the justice system.
Yeah.
But wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But I think that in that the Pluto part has been going on for a while, and this is Saturn joining it. We're looking at all of these zombie institutions, and then this hooks into a much larger thing, which again, I'll attempt to be very brief about now, which is that we are in the last, Saturn and Capricorn is going to play us out, not only of this decade, but over 200 years of Jupiter, Saturn in Earth signs.
Yes.
This is literally, we are in the last 3 years of an era that began in 1802. This is the Earth cycle, and we've learned a lot about natural resources and how matter works. We had all of the industrial revolutions during this period, and both the advantages, what we've learned from this period, as well as the giant disadvantages of the patterns that we collectively have adopted, I think will become increasingly clear. I see this Saturn-Pluto as a retrospective on the last 215 years.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Austin, because when we have Saturn moving to early Aquarius, we'll have that next Saturn-Jupiter conjunction, and that is actually the triplicity shift, because that will then, we did have a taste of the air conjunctions in 1980, I think, or 81, 79, 80, 81, when they were both in Libra. So we had a taste, and then in 2000 we went back to Earth for the final sort of 20 years. So I think that's a really good point, Austin, that it's not just this current Saturn-Pluto conjunction, put it into context of this larger 200-year cycle. And it really begs the question around even decentralization of industrial power, if you like.
Okay, I got to jump in on that because I've been looking a lot at the triplicity cycle.
Yep.
And every other time that we move from Earth to air, which is what we're doing, you get big, solidified, concretized empires broken up. So there are a couple different ways to count the beginning and ending, because they're mutation conjunctions, they're mean conjunctions, they're apparent conjunctions. But basically, roughly about 400 AD is when you get a shift from Earth to air. And so you have the end of the Western Roman Empire. What's interesting is before that, in the 4th century BC, they repeat about every 800 years. You have Alexander sweeping through the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia and breaking up the Persian Empire. And Alexander did not leave behind him an empire. I believe his empire endured for about 2 years, and then soon it was, 5, 6, 7 different competing areas. And then finally, so you go from 400 plus 800, then we get to 1200, and we have Genghis Khan. And so what's interesting is the Khans come in and they establish the largest land empire ever, which doesn't last at all and breaks up. And so what's interesting is we have this scattering like the wind, where even though there's a force like Alexander or Genghis who seem like they're conquering and holding, really what they're doing is breaking up an existing structure. And the time period which follows it is actually, it's the Hellenistic period.
Did we lose him?
Yeah, the connection's starting to go in and out.
During that 400. Genghis's conquest ended up connecting lots of areas. So there's this weird disruptive conquerors actually breaking up structure and allowing things to circulate as is appropriate for air. And there's more to it.
It's possibly, Austin's probably got enough to say that we could do a whole show on that, or a discussion about that triplicity shift.
Yeah, we're starting to lose your connection, Austin. So I think it might be because it's such a long episode, so the recording file might be getting big on our computers. So we might want to wrap it up. I need to quickly throw in the electional chart because I forgot to mention the election because it actually takes place at the very end of the month. So I'm going to throw that in really quick so we can wrap up. So this is the electional chart I'm going to show on the screen right now that Lisa Scheim came up with for this month, and it takes place on December 28th, 2017. So the deal is basically there's some pretty good Mars and Scorpio elections because it's one of the few dignified planets this month. And that's something that we talked about a lot earlier in this episode, how, we have, especially in the second half of the month, we've got Mars and Scorpio in its own sign with Jupiter. And then we have Saturn in Capricorn in its own sign with Venus later in the month. So this becomes a sort of time frame where you could choose between which malefic you wanted to use for an electional chart, because typically when malefics are dignified, it's a little bit easier to use them constructively and for their more positive sides to come out, as long as you situate them properly in your electional chart, that you can kind of wield that power for good, or at least for some constructive benefit to yourself, which is something I think that you started to say at one point, Austin, but we didn't fully go into. I don't know if you want to expand on that shortly here.
No, I think that's sufficient.
Okay, so the chart that Lisa came up with is this one. So it's December 28th around, let's say around 2:30 in the morning, 2:30 a.m. With early Scorpio rising. So this is a night chart. It has Scorpio rising with Mars in Scorpio in the first whole sign house, and Mars is applying to a conjunction with Jupiter. So this is basically trying to take that Mars in Scorpio and make it the focal point of your electional chart, and make it so that the ruler of the ascendant is in its own sign, so it's able to draw on its own significations. It's in the first house, and it's applying to a conjunction with a benefic in the first house while being a night chart, so that Mars is much more constructive and much more positive than it would be otherwise. So the moon in this chart is exalted in Taurus. It's just recently ingressed into Taurus, into the seventh whole sign house. From that point, it's actually applying in its next aspect. It's separating from a trine with Saturn at 0 degrees of Capricorn, and it's applying to a trine with Venus at 3 degrees of Capricorn, which is actually its domicile lord. So Venus is the ruler of the seventh house, and the moon is in the seventh house, applying to a trine with Venus within 3 degrees. And since this is a night chart, Venus is actually the more positive benefic in this chart. So the tricky thing, of course, is that in this electional chart, you have that stellium of planets in Capricorn, which are Saturn, Venus, the Sun, and Pluto, but it's a night chart because the sun is in the third house below the horizon. So that's one of the tricky things during this time period. Somebody sent in a question about, dealing with both of the malefics being in their domiciles during this time in late December. And it's one of the tricky things because one of them, is going to be contrary to the sect or opposite to the sect of the chart, and therefore is going to exhibit its more destructive or more problematic significations. In this instance, that's going to be Saturn, and so there's the potential for some third house difficulties. That is offset slightly by Saturn being in its own domicile and Venus being co-present there in the same sign in the third house, but I'm still not sure that I would otherwise recommend this as a major third house type electional chart. Instead, I would really emphasize it primarily for just Mars and Scorpio type activities, just because I can't really think, I'm trying to think of a better situation in terms of Mars or a better electional chart for Mars, and I'm having trouble really thinking of one than this. I mean, can you guys think of a better setup for Mars and Scorpio or something that would be more auspicious?
I mean, Mars and Scorpio on the rising, that's great.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
The only thing I can think of is to go back to what you were saying earlier, Austin, is if it was happening in earlier degrees when Mars still had more dignity, maybe. But that's a very Virgo splitting hairs
I don't know. Yeah, as far as splitting hairs go, moon opposite Mars, even by sign, even though it's not the applying aspect, makes me slightly nervous.
Yeah, we had another one. The initial one we were going to go with, and this is one we're going to recommend in the auspicious elections episode, which is 24 hours later, which looks like this, where the moon is already separating from Mars and it's applying to Jupiter through the opposition. The only reason we didn't recommend that is just because on the West Coast, I think that you can't get the application still, so you would miss it. So we were a little nervous about recommending that as our primary election this month. Whereas if you go with the day earlier, at least the next application is that very positive Moon Venus trine.
Yeah. I mean, it's totally workable.
Sure. But that's a good point that, one of the things that it does have is the moon opposing Mars, but at least you get the trine from Venus, and it's a night chart so that Mars is not as malefic, and it's the ruler of the first house. So some of those keywords that we were using earlier about Mars and Scorpio, and Austin, you were using sort of keywords and terms like, tremendous drive and focus and things like that, because it's a fixed water sign ruled by Mars, right?
Yeah, ferocious determination.
Ferocious determination. I like that. So that would be a good keyword for if there's something that you need to do that requires that kind of ferocious determination, then this would be a good election to do it. Of course, you're either going to have to stay up very late or you're going to have to get up very early to use this election at 2:30 in the morning. But sometimes that's the cost of doing electional astrology. So I have other little things built into this chart, like Mars is in the second house, Mercury is in the second house at 14 degrees of Sagittarius. And I would recommend, if you can, in your location, adjusting the time so that the degree of the midheaven is trining Mercury in order to give it a little bit extra power, even though it's in the second house, which is an aversion to the first house. But yeah, otherwise, that's about the chart, about 2:30 in the morning on December 28th at the very end of the month. So that's the primary election that Lisa found for this month that I would endorse for our main or our best electional chart that we could find. There was a few other charts that we're going to talk about on the Auspicious Elections episode, which is available to patrons of the Astrology Podcast on the $5 or $10 tiers, including, I think, some Saturn and Capricorn elections, which we'll get into in that episode. So, all right. So that's the electional chart, and I'll put that on the website for those that are listening to the audio version of the podcast. And I think that pretty much brings us to the end of the month. Are there any other final things that we need to mention towards the end of the month? I mean, we did mention that Mercury stations direct December 22nd, right?
Yeah. So it's, just in time for us to turn our full attention to Saturn and Capricorn.
Yeah. So that will be the last final thing that dominates the end of the month, and we'll save the full discussion for the broader, both mundane and personal implications of Saturn and Capricorn for another episode that hopefully we'll do pretty soon. So you're thinking maybe we could do it later in December, Austin, or how are you feeling about that at this point?
Yeah. Anytime after the ingress, I'm good. I don't have a busy travel-y Christmas, so
yeah, I might run into some issues with doing more than one show then, but we can chat about scheduling.
Sure.
Because I will be traveling.
Yeah, and then of course our next forecast episode that we're going to have to record at the end of December is going to be the year ahead, since at the end of each year we always do like a full year ahead episode. So we'll have to keep that in mind as well, since that's always a much bigger one to do than our usual monthly, like let's look at the next 4 weeks episodes. All right. Well, I will stop the screen share here and turn the video off. So I think that brings us then to the end of this forecast episode. So thanks a lot, everybody, for joining us. Thanks to everyone, all of our patrons who joined us for the live recording of this episode. And thanks, Austin and Kelly, for joining me for talking about December, and I'll see you guys again next month.
Have a great month, guys.
All right. I will end it here. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Yeah,
and
sounds like we'll see each other quite a bit. Yeah, I hope everyone has a nice month.
Yeah. I think we're good. We're having some delays in the thing just because the episode's getting so long. So I will end it here. But thanks, everyone, for listening, and we will see you next time.
Bye.
Okay.